Citizens of the world, I speak for you, knowing that my message will always be twisted or framed, which will result that you all will think that I am the main perpetrator. But the only thing that I've done is protecting my fellow countrymen. I'm not interested in overpowering any other nations or disrupting of various worldwide markets, or be any kind of frustration in any kind of process. I am not against the citizens of Europe. It's your leaders who are against the citizens of Europe. I know that you have been indoctrinated for generations with propaganda, but this is your wake-up call. Why would I blow up my own gas pipes? I can simply shut them down. All these kinds of accusations against Russia are very easy to debunk. Like, who is bombing the nuclear factory at this moment?
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Citizens of the world, I speak for you, knowing that my message will always be twisted or framed, which will result that you all will think that I am the main perpetrator. But the only thing that I've done is protecting my fellow countrymen. I'm not interested in overpowering any other nations or disrupting of various worldwide markets, or be any kind of frustration in any kind of process. I am not against the citizens of Europe. It's your leaders who are against the citizens of Europe. I know that you have been indoctrinated for generations with propaganda, but this is your wake-up call. Why would I blow up my own gas pipes? I can simply shut them down. All these kinds of accusations against Russia are very easy to debunk. Like, who is bombing the nuclear factory at this moment?
How many things have been blamed on Russia over the past 5 or 6 years by the Western media, by the EU, by neoliberals and deep state operatives, that turned out to be completely false? They even invented a conspiracy theory. You probably remember that Russia had some super secret hypersonic weapon that was causing brain damage in American diplomats that nobody had ever heard of before, and it turned out to be debunked even by the CIA. Why would Russia explode their own pipeline that gives them enormous amounts of leverage? They can turn off that pipeline at any time that they want, which gives them exactly the power that they most want. I don't know who did this, but what I do know is what you said, that a state could only do this. But also the U.S. has been obsessed for years, going back to the Bush administration, with trying to bully and coerce and persuade the Europeans not to buy natural gas from Moscow, but to instead buy it from the United States. Donald Trump, while he was being called a Putin asset or blackmailed by the Kremlin, was one of the leaders in badgering the Germans, saying, we pay you for your defense, you should be buying natural gas from us. And now suddenly the pipeline blows up in the middle of this war, and we're going to blame Russia for that?
Yesterday, NATO held a secret meeting that was exposed by the New York Times. According to the New York Times, 40 NATO members met in secret to ramp up their war in Ukraine, not de-escalate the war. Their goal, of course, is to turn this into a forever war, which is what they want. Here's what the New York Times says. In a sign that the United States and its allies believe that the fighting in Ukraine will last years, military officials from more than 40 countries gathered in NATO's headquarters in Brussels on Wednesday to discuss how their governments can ramp up production of arms and ammunition.
European official says sabotage likely cause of suspicious Nord Stream leak. So that's a post-millennial. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen noted that while it is too early to conclude whether the incidents were act of sabotage, there are 3 leaks and therefore it is difficult to imagine that it could be accidental. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said, we don't know all the details of what happened, but we can clearly see that it's an act of sabotage. He's not even saying maybe. He said we can clearly see that it's an act of sabotage related to the next step of escalation of the situation in Ukraine. On Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we have to look at who owns most of it, right? If I own a company and I have leverage over you, and if I hurt the company that I'm the majority owner of, I'm an idiot. So let's see who owns majority of Nord Stream pipeline. So 51% is owned by Gazprom. So let's see who is Gazprom. They are the largest supplier of natural gas in the world, accounting for approximately 15% of the world's gas production. It was established as a joint stock company in 1993 and partly owned by the Russian state, over 50%. Interesting. Number two is another company called Wintershall D, 15.5%. Now, this company, with the merger of Wintershall Holding AG and DEA Deutsch German Erdol AG, two successful companies with a long tradition, have formed Europe's leading independent natural gas and oil company. But the point is, 51% is Russia. So if you cause this and you're Russia, you will go down in the history books as the biggest idiot of all time for giving up the leverage that you have during a time like this. This is pretty creepy for the people that are saying U.S. could have done it, because there is documentation and proof that U.S. could be behind this.
Everything changed over the past few hours when Vladimir Putin said yesterday that they are at war now with NATO. This represents a massive shift in the Russia-Ukrainian war. There are a lot of moving pieces, and for that we wanted to bring in expert analysis, former UN weapons inspector, former Marine, Scott Ritter. What does this mean exactly for NATO countries? First, I want to start there. Like, what is the United States now going to do? Or, what will Germany do now that we called a spade a spade?
We need to get down to, first principles here. The United States, NATO, and Europe have had a concerted policy direction since the end of the Cold War that when it comes to Russia, calls for the perpetual weakening of Russia, up to and including the dissolution of Russia, the Russian Federation as it currently exists. The decade of the 1990s was all about the castration of Russia. Let's just call it what it was. It was the economic and political castration of Russia. The national security establishment here in the United States, there's papers that back this up, and I'm sure if I dug deep enough into NATO and Europe, I'd find the same, that said we must make sure that Russia never again rises to the level of the Soviet Union, that though it is the West's interest to keep Russia down in perpetuity. That was the policy. The West has never been Russia's friend, never tried to be Russia's friend. It was all about economic exploitation and political castration. This is the reality that existed when Vladimir Putin came into power in late 1999. And it's a policy that's been in play ever since then. So this notion that, NATO expansion is something new. No, NATO expansion has always been there. And we see James Baker, when he came back from his discussion with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, and he reported to the Bush National Security Council that, hey, I sort of committed to, we're not going to expand NATO. He was shouted down and said, nope, we are expanding NATO because our policy is to permanently constrain Russia, and we need an expanded NATO to do that. And so, from the Russian perspective, this war, this conflict in Ukraine, it's not how the West has portrayed it as Russian aggression. This is Russia saying our back has been put up against the wall. We know what you want. We know what you're trying to do. We've spent a whole bunch of time trying to talk you out of this, including promulgating 2 draft treaties in December 17th of last year that said, hey, why don't we just sit back and look at a new European security framework that tones everything down, backs you up, keeps us neutral, a band of neutrality. We don't need to worry about direct conflict. NATO and the United States wouldn't even consider it. Instead, they were going forward with a policy that had been in place since 2014 to use Ukraine and Ukraine's accession into NATO as a vehicle to gut Russia. Again, going back to the original policy, to permanently cripple Russia, to lead to the political, neutering of Russia, beyond simply removing Putin from power, ensuring that whoever replaced Putin could never be a strong leader because Russia would never be a strong nation. This is the reality. So when NATO started supplying weapons to Ukraine, Russia knew what the game was. They knew straight up what it was. It didn't take long for NATO to admit it. When we have Lloyd Austin traveling to Kiev and saying, look, the goal and objective here is to bleed Russia dry. He said the goal is to weaken Russia to the point that Russia can never again carry out this kind of activity. And I've said this all along, that when you infuse tens of billions of dollars of military assistance into a nation like Ukraine, you fundamentally change the game. This is a game-changing event, because what you're saying isn't that I'm simply trying to empower Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression. No, the NATO game is to empower Ukraine to be able to carry out offensive action to expel Russia from the Donbass, to expel Russia from Kherson, to recapture Crimea. And this is important because right now, NATO can politically get away with it because, legally speaking, in the eyes of much of the world, Kherson is Ukraine. Right. Even Russia will say it's Ukraine right now. Zaporizhia, Ukraine. Donbass, Russia says they're independent, but they're not yet Russia. What Vladimir Putin did is set in motion the events that will make every piece of territory where a Russian soldier currently stands Mother Russia, in the eyes of Russia, which means any action undertaken by Ukraine or NATO against this territory, targeting this territory, becomes an act of war against Russia. What Putin has done is put it right in the face of NATO and say, do you want war? Here's your chance. I'm here. Russia's here. We're here. Bring it on. Because if you do, it's all over for you. Putin, it wasn't bluff when he said, we have the means to defend ourselves. We have better weapons than you. Everybody knows what he's talking about. Nuclear weapons. We are literally, they have that doomsday clock. You got to move it to 1 second before midnight. We're this close to the world ending. That close. Right like that. Jeez. If NATO doesn't back the hell off, if NATO continues to pretend that this is some game designed to weaken Russia. Russia just fundamentally changed the rule. They said, we're not playing that game anymore. Remember I talked about game-changing event? The game has changed. And NATO needs to wake up to the fact that anything it does once the referendum is passed is an act of war against Russia. And Russia will treat it as such and respond accordingly. It will not be a slow roll out. If NATO continues to provide Ukraine with the means to attack Mother Russia, which very soon will be Kherson, Zaporizhia, all that. Stoltenberg is purely an administrator. So the wise thing to do would be for Joe Biden to call up Stoltenberg and say, you will never speak again, ever. And if you do, I'll terminate you. I can do that. I'm the president of the United States. I will go to NATO and say, fire him. Stoltenberg needs to shut up for the sake of the world, because he's saying things that he's not empowered to act on any of this. Other people have to make these decisions, not him. And the military committee of NATO, very interestingly, came out and said, we're not at war with Russia. We're not at war with Russia. We're providing weapons for Ukraine to defend itself, but we are not at war with Russia. So the difference in the tone between the people who really make a decision and this named Stoltenberg is night and day. The people who really make the decision understand what's about to happen, and they are quickly backing off. The gloves are off. This has been a special military operation, and we've discussed that in the past about how it constrains Russia. All constraints are off. When Russia is talking about defending Mother Russia, they are now going to bring all of its abilities to the forefront to accomplish this task. Something I talked to a Russian about yesterday. I talked about partial mobilization, and he said, remember, it's partial mobilization. It's only 300,000. We got 25 million. We can go as big as you want to go. And Russia's ready to go as big as necessary. And if NATO wants to make this an issue, then Russia will cross that threshold, meaning that if NATO wants to threaten the existence of Russia by attacking Mother Russia, either directly or through the Ukrainian proxy, then Russia will use every means at its disposal to ensure that will fail, up to including nuclear weapons. Sergei Lavrov said there's two conditions under which nuclear weapons can be used under Russian doctrine. Condition one, you attack us with nukes. We will respond. Condition two, you threaten the national survival of the Russian nation, and we will use nuclear weapons. NATO right now is posturing itself to threaten the national survival of the Russian nation.